And good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. It is another exciting edition of the Weekly Pitch. Matt Price coming to you from my house in Rockland County, New York. Well, it took 5 weeks, but last Sunday, The Last Dance was finally complete. The 10-part docuseries on Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls, who won 6 NBA titles in the 1990s. And it talked all about not just the players on those Bulls teams, especially Michael Jordan, but as well as how the Chicago Bulls were able to win that final title, which Phil Jackson put it pretty much right on the money, and that was The Last Dance. Now we finally know why it was called The Last Dance. So we're going to talk about it for the entire show. So I want to welcome in my panel for this week, and it's the same as last week, James Murphy and Bryan Hultgren. Bryan, that is some jersey you're wearing. I wonder why you're wearing it, and I wonder who's on it.
Oh, well, of course, I don't know if you can actually see it, but of course, we're going to talk about the greatest dynasty in NBA history. You got to represent with the greatest athlete of the 20th century, and oh my God, I'm really excited for this week's episode.
James, you got to be excited too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's so much to talk about, especially when you consider that going into this, there were a lot of people who thought LeBron was the greatest of all time, but I feel like a lot of those opinions have changed now that the knowledge about Michael Jordan has come out and the impact he had on the game and the world throughout the entire 90s.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you know what? That's where I want to start the conversation. You look at who Michael Jordan was. All we knew before this series was Michael Jordan, before LeBron James, was the best NBA player of the 90s, and you could say also in the early 2000s, depending on how you look at how he played with the Washington Wizards. But he was the guy. He was the guy in not just American sports, but in all sports in general. But when you look at the 10-part series, it's as if you're going into Michael Jordan's mind. You see sides of him that you rarely see in the present day and that you rarely saw in the past. So I want to start with you, James. What was going through your mind when you were watching the entire series? Did you think that did this series change your thoughts on Michael Jordan as a person and as a player?
Well, going into it, I was of somewhat of a belief that LeBron did a lot more things than Michael Jordan, that he played better into the latter parts of his career. But after that documentary, you realize that there's certain things that Jordan went through that not even LeBron could sniff. Michael had far more media coverage. He had far more pressure to win. He had far tougher opponents to face, especially within his own conference. And he just had to overcome so much to get to where he was. And it puts a lot of perspective, especially when we were talking about the GOAT debate last week. There was a lot of people going into there who were around our age who never really knew Jordan as well. And we had only seen LeBron, and so we had to go with him being the greatest. But when you now have that perspective of the pressure that he had from the media and from just having the type of fame that he had, it really puts a whole new spin on the subject.
So, Bryan, you're the one wearing the Jordan jersey. I'll ask you the same question. After watching the series, did this make you think a little bit differently about Jordan, or do you still think of him as the same NBA player that you heard about growing up and that you still think in regards to, do you think he's still the same person? Do you still think he's the same person after watching that entire series?
Yeah, for me, it's kind of a multi-layered answer because, for me, my main experience with Michael Jordan growing up was when his game against, I can't believe they didn't even talk about this enough, about his incredible comeback leading the Toon Stars against the Monstars in Space Jam. I mean, that was really my main exposure to Michael Jordan growing up. But watching this documentary, I knew the basics. He was a 6-time champion, best basketball player of all time, but I really didn't get the full story on Michael Jordan other than some highlights from what I would see on ESPN and other sporting events. But when you really look at like Michael Jordan's story and like just all the mountains he had to overcome, not just in speaking in terms of basketball, but all the personal stuff he had to go through as well. You know, talking about his father and like ultimately what happened to him and how he was abducted and killed. I mean, obviously talking about, you know, the conference finals that I think was probably the more meat of the story than the NBA finals were. Because I think that's where the legacy of Michael Jordan really gravitated me towards. But what really made me change my tune about him and made me love him even more was just his work ethic that he had, that he was fully dedicated to basketball. It was all he knew. He sacrificed everything to achieve his fame, and basically just how he drove others to play to their full potential. I mean, it's something that you rarely see out of very few guys, and just the commitment he had. And that's really what made me respect him even more. His commitment to excellence and being perfect. Like, it's something that very few athletes or even people in this world today have. And you gotta love it.
The other thing you got to love is throughout every practice, throughout every game, Michael Jordan was a guy who wanted to win.
Yes.
He wanted to win so badly, and he also wanted to do it as a team. Even if after you watch a docuseries, you can argue, is this guy caring more about the team or is he caring more about himself in terms of winning? Like you could ask yourself that question. From what I saw, it was both. He wanted to win for himself, and he also wanted to win for his team.
Yeah, like I was just picking back on that. Like some of the best parts of the story in the Last Dance were some of the stories the guys were telling, like about one of the Bulls players talking about how he, like Michael, Dennis Rodman, Scottie, and a few of the other guys who were gambling in the back of the plane, like with millions and thousands of dollars, and then he came up to the front of the plane where all like the poor players were playing. And was like, "Hey, get me in! I want in!" Like, dude, like you're richer than us and could probably spend more money than us. Why do you want to join us? Because I want to beat you, and I want to say I have your money in my wallet. I mean, it's just like everything
Massive
with Michael
flex.
Jordan.
Massive
That
flex.
is just so insane. Like everything to him was a competition. Like, and I agree. Like he wanted to win for himself, but he also wanted to win as a team, and that's really what I think made him so likable, because he wanted to win, but he wanted to help elevate his teammates and others to help raise to that level that he was on.
In one of the later episodes, I can't remember if it was the 7th or the 8th, but there was one moment when Jordan was basically bad-mouthing his own players during practice. And I can't remember I couldn't remember
Steve Kerr. I think it was Steve Kerr. I think
No. That's not who I'm referring to. I can't remember if it was John Paxson or someone else who was interviewed for this and was saying that, it was, that the kind of, I guess you could say, practice strategy that Jordan was playing on his teammates. It's as if, they were hating it, but then they realized that Jordan was just doing this to make them better. And in the end, and I apologize, I can't remember who said this, but in the end, it worked. It worked. It was as if even though Jordan was the player, he was also the teacher. James, can you agree with that?
Oh, for sure. And I don't think the Bulls really get where they are without that sort of leadership. That's a big reason why he is considered to be as great as he was. Sure, the stats were there, and sure, he was good for his teammates in terms of distributing the ball and getting it to guys who needed to, especially under Phil Jackson's offense. But they don't get to where they are without that leadership, because there's just something about work ethic, especially in the NBA, which is such a player-driven league, that makes such a difference when you get to those game sevens, whether it be in the conference finals or the NBA finals. And you can show throughout the documentary how huge it was and how big the payoff was for all those Bulls teams.
Brian, you mentioned before about how Michael Jordan had to go through all that personal stuff in the middle of the 90s. I remember after the 93 season. Now remember, none of us were alive. All three of us were not alive when all this took place, for the most part. But when you look at what happened in the mid 90s, and, this was a guy who didn't have a gambling addiction, but did love to gamble. And at the same time, There was that Atlantic City story, and
Yeah.
then you have what happened with his father, which was horrible. I mean, this is a guy just taking a nap in his car, and then these two guys basically jump the car, shoot James Jordan, and toss him into a river, or toss him into a creek, and Michael Jordan loses his father in one of the worst ways possible. Just horrific. But then you see these quote unquote journalists, and I say that in quotes because I know real journalists would not do anything like this.
Journalists in name only.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Just putting out these conspiracy theories that Michael somehow, some way, with all the gambling and whatnot, had to do with the murder. It was flat out ridiculous. And just watching that part alone just made me so angry. And those people who put that out there in newspapers or whatever, saying that, thinking as if they know better than everyone else. I was saying to myself, and I'm sorry to say this word, don't worry, it's not a curse word, but I'm sorry that I'm saying this word, that those people didn't give a damn about Michael. Like, they wanted something to say in terms of negativity when it comes to Michael Jordan. And that just really pissed me off. That made me so angry. And I'm sure, Brian, that made you really pissed off as well.
Like, of course it made me angry, but I think in the same breath, what it made me really do was just have a whole nother level of respect for Michael Jordan in terms of how he handled it. Like, did he handle some of it perfectly? You could argue probably not. He probably shouldn't have gone to Atlantic City after like that loss to the Knicks. Yeah, he probably could have done a few things differently here or there. But for the most part, like, having to go through all of that, like losing your father in that one instant and having the entire media landscape, or not in the entire, like a lot of people, a lot of them were. A lot of them just like trying to put one and one, two together, trying to create conspiracy theories to get a story, like possibly try to create a distraction, like or trying to find something that wasn't there to begin with. Like, I don't know how you would be able to do that, or really how you'd be able to get through that. But Michael just found a way to get through it. He coped in his own way, as evident by his baseball season, which obviously went pretty well for him until the players' strike. But then coming back to the Bulls, finding more success again, and it's just like, that's just an instant like that alone could destroy a person's life. But Michael found a way to get past it, overcome it, and just rise above. And it just speaks levels to the man himself, not just the player, but the man. And it's truly inspiring.
It was like, it's as if, you know how he and the Bulls in the early 90s, they had to get past the Detroit Pistons in mostly the Eastern Conference Finals. And when it comes to the personal stuff, these were real Pistons, if you know what I mean. Like, these were real barriers that he somehow, some way had to get around, and he did it in one of the most, I guess you could say, manliest ways possible. It was just unbelievable to watch, and especially in times like that. I now want to shift over to the Pistons, and James, this is where I'll come back to you. Obviously, one of the main controversies that we saw throughout the docuseries, in fact, it was very much in the middle of the series, was when the Pistons, two-time NBA champs, all of a sudden they lost to the Bulls. This was on the Bulls' first run to the NBA Finals in the early 90s. I think it was 91.
91, because that's when they played Magic Johnson in the Lakers.
Thank you very much, Brian. It was 1991. And the Pistons, in the game that they lost the whole thing, they walked off the court. And it wasn't just Isaiah Thomas. It was the entire team basically walking off the court. Now, Isaiah Thomas explained that in the past, the Celtics had done the same thing to the Pistons when the Pistons won a game. And they did it as if, it was a normal thing. But obviously, and I was looking all over Twitter when people saw the revelation of what had happened, that basically that snub by Thomas himself, because remember, Thomas was the guy on the Pistons at the time. He was one of the main leaders. That snub, especially of Michael Jordan, might have cost him a spot on the 1992 U.S. Dream Team. Now, obviously, there were other players that had problems with Thomas, especially players like Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. Like, there were so many players and teams out there who hated playing Isaiah Thomas and the Pistons. But do you think that snub itself cost Thomas a spot on the U.S. Dream Team, or no? Do you think that it was just one of those times where, the spots were full and all that?
Well, let's make one thing pretty clear about the Pistons, and I think the documentary did that very well. They were a different team compared to what was going on in that era. A lot of people wanted to see the Lakers and the Celtics and a lot of the other bigger teams, maybe even the Bulls. They wanted to see the Knicks. They wanted to see maybe whatever other, I don't know who else was in the West besides the Lakers, but they wanted to see all the big franchises win. The Pistons say, to hell with that. Not only are we going to spoil that, but we're going to knock around all of those guys for 48 minutes, and we don't care if we have to hack these guys all night. We're going to make sure they don't get to the basket, and we're going to play rough and tumble basketball for 48 minutes. If you can't handle it, then get out. And you could see that mentality come through in not only the rest of the documentary, but to get closer to your question, in terms of Isaiah Thomas, he definitely obviously doing that, if you're the Pistons, creating that sort of culture, I guess came at a price. Obviously, it worked out for the better because they did end up getting 2 titles out of it, but I guess it came at a price. And I guess in Isaiah Thomas's case, that price was being able to be selected to that team. And look, you mentioned how a couple seconds ago how they walked off the court earlier towards the end of the game. And look, that's just how they did things back then. I don't think it was inherently wrong, but
even so, you could argue it was unsportsmanlike. You could argue
it was, but again, that's just how they did things back. That's just how the Pistons were back then. They weren't there to be liked. They didn't care if everyone hated them outside of Auburn Hills and Detroit, Michigan. They did not care. That was their brand. I can respect that. I can absolutely respect that. Frankly, I'd like to see a few more teams like that. But yeah, it did come at a price, and for Isaiah Thomas, that price was the snubbery from the Dream Team, and that's just how it is sometimes.
Bryan, you want to piggyback on that?
I mean, really nothing really much else to say about that one. I mean, obviously the Pistons were a much different organization and they handled their things differently way back when. But I think in a way it kind of did come at a price, and it kind of did rub people off the wrong way. Because I think with Michael and with the Bulls, I think their mentality was look, you beat us the last 2 times. The last one pretty soundly in your home turf in 7 games. This time we come at you. We hit you harder than ever. The least you could do is just show some sort of courtesy with that. And I think that alienated their relationship, IT from MJ, for the rest of their lives. I mean, obviously, it had an impact on Scottie Pippen. Magic Johnson had issues with IT. Larry Bird has his issues with IT. And I think it's just the fact that he didn't really seem to care about what he did. And you really do see it in the documentary. He just seemed nonchalant about it. He didn't seem like he regretted it. If he was genuinely sorry, at the time, or even said in a private conversation, maybe we didn't handle this right. Maybe this impacted, could have had an impact. But, I meant nothing against you. And maybe that could have fixed everything. Maybe it wouldn't have. But I guess I don't know if it had to do with his playing ability. Obviously, it didn't. MJ said it himself. He's the number 2 point guard right behind Magic Johnson. But to say that it had an impact overall, I don't necessarily think it was just Jordan, because I think IT and those Pistons teams just burned so many bridges in the NBA at that time that I think the reputation for IT, it definitely did come with a price.
It did, yeah. And you know what? When I think of that relationship between IT and Michael, I think of the relationship of a couple of teammates, and you both know who I might be talking about. It was Shaq and Kobe. Now, Shaq and Kobe, those two were able to come to terms years after their last year together on the Lakers. But here, it seems IT and Jordan, no love lost between those two at all. So now my question is, and Bryan, I'll stay with you on this one. Do you think those two, in the end, will ever find common ground? no matter what happens in the future, because I mean, I'm hopeful. It happened between Shaq and Kobe. Will it happen here?
Yeah, like even like with stuff like Larry Bird and Magic, like those two probably didn't like each other at all in the 80s or were bitter rivals. But today, it's obviously mulled over. They'll smile and pose for the cameras and they'll have some good conversation. But in terms of IT and Michael, I just don't know. I really don't know because, yeah, sometimes relationships mold over time, like Kobe and Shaq. But there are some where they definitely don't like each other and they're going to clash at each other endlessly, even when it's pointless at this point. Another example of that, like if I could just pull off the top of my head, John Calipari and Jim Calhoun, like those two despised each other back in the days of the like 80s and 90s when Jim Calhoun was at UConn and Calipari was at UMass. Those two taking shots at each other, and all the way through 2011, whenever they got the chance to dish at each other, they would take it. Like Calipari, like taking shots at Jim Calhoun, saying that UConn was afraid to play UMass, or Jim Calhoun saying that Calipari wasn't a good New Englander, or in the 2011 NBA Finals when he called like the other three remaining coaches. His two of them were like his favorite sons, and the other one was like the disappointment or something like that. So I just don't know. It's really about whether or not IT or even MJ can swallow their pride and put bygones be bygones. But yeah, I just don't know.
So now I want to dive into the Bulls team itself because there were multiple pieces, multiple players who Michael Jordan played with. Of course, there was Steve Kerr. Of course, there was Tony Kukoc. There was Scottie Pippen. There was
Dennis Rodman.
Dennis Rodman. Yes, thank you very much. I want to start with Scottie Pippen because Scottie Pippen was one of the leaders of those Bulls teams. He really was. But you could argue the fact that when Jordan, quote unquote, retired after the 92-93 season, and a lot of pressure was put on Scottie Pippen. He was supposed to be the new leader. There's one game that I can't stop thinking about, and this was definitely in the middle of the series. I can't remember if it was the 6th or 7th episode. And Scottie Pippen in a playoff game, he wanted to take the final shot. Now look, we can all agree on one thing. Any player, any basketball player, man or woman, would dream of making a game-winning shot at the buzzer. And, that's the position the Bulls were in this particular playoff game. I think it was against the Knicks.
Yeah, it was the Knicks. It was like Game 3 of the 1994 Eastern Conference Finals, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Was it Game 3? I feel like it was a Game 5 or something.
No, it was like I think it was Game 3 because it was the first game back in Chicago after the Knicks took the first two at Madison Square Garden.
Right. Now, for this particular case, the game was tied at 102 with just less than 2 seconds remaining in regulation. Phil Jackson, who, by the way, I have great respect for, despite everything that happened with him in the Knicks. I have great respect for Phil Jackson. Okay. And he wanted to come up with a play where Kukoc had the ball. And the reason why was because Kukoc was known for so many game winners throughout that particular season. Now, Scottie Pippen, who replaced Jordan as, you could say, number one on this particular Bulls team, he wanted to have the ball. So you know what happened? He sat down. And when he sat down saying, nope, I'm sitting this play. I don't care what happens. I'm sitting this play. I was thinking, what are you doing? You're Scottie Pippen. You are the new Mike. You're supposed to be the new Michael Jordan. You're going to give up on your team. Even if your team wins the game, you're just going to give up like that. You're going to sit that one out. Like, that was so unprofessional. It was so mind-boggling. It just showed that he cared more about himself than he cared about the team. Like, I'm thinking, what are you doing? James, when you saw that, your mind must have gone through the roof. You must have been saying, man, this is who Scottie Pippen, even if it was a one-off, you got to be saying to yourself, this is who Scottie Pippen was?
Well, two things came to mind as I saw that scene. One, it's a good thing Tony Kukoc made that shot because it sort of served as a reality check to Scottie Pippen. Two,
Yeah.
it showed that Scottie Pippen
It saved
wasn't
his
quite
legacy.
as good of a
Yeah.
leader as the team needed him to be at the time. Now, obviously, there's going to be added pressure when the greatest player of all time, even after he had only won 3 rings, decides to retire in the prime of his career. But at the same time, you've been around to a point where you should be able to demonstrate some sort of leadership in any case. Now, if you're doing this in a regular season game, maybe it's one thing, but this is the playoffs where you can win the game and the series and move on to the next round. You're right, Matt. My mind was very much boggled. And listen, as an athlete, Scottie Pippen, phenomenal. Could probably be a number 1 on any other team in NBA history.
He's a Hall of
except
Famer.
for maybe,
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe a couple of Celtics teams. Brian, you could help me out with that once we're done with this recording. But point being, as a leader, his credibility was definitely shot there. Now, you might have been – now, this was definitely apparent earlier in the documentary and later in years when he sat out his when he first put off injury until he missed time during the season and ended up holding out and asking for a trade in the middle of a title run. But again, it just demonstrated that he didn't show the type of leadership necessary for a number 1 guy.
Yeah, I think that's really piggybacking on that. I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways for me, that the Last Dance really doesn't always paint Scottie Pippen in the brightest light, because a lot of the things that really stand out from this documentary are the negative stuff. The contract disputes that he had with Jerry Krause. I'll have some words about him later.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously you had the stuff with this game in particular, him sitting out injury, and it's just that. Scottie, I'm with you. Scottie Pippen is probably the greatest number 2 man in NBA history for what he did with Michael Jordan in those 90s Bulls. He's a Hall of Famer. He's one of the best basketball players of all time. But, this part made me really did kind of lose some respect for him. And, the part that really irritated me to an extent was when he said, if I could go back, I probably wouldn't have done it. I probably wouldn't have done it any differently, because that's where I was at that point. That's just,
you were saying sorry, not sorry, because he apologized to the team even after the game, just minutes after the game, when one of his teammates, I can't remember who it was
it Horace Grant?
I don't think it was Horace Grant.
I think it was Horace Grant or Steve Kerr. I think maybe, because I remember Kerr was talking about that a lot in detail.
Right. I can't remember who. I can't remember who it was.
Either.
But someone on the Bulls was talking to the team after that. You could say controversial ending, in terms of the Bulls' sake, and Pippen literally told his teammates, "I'm sorry." But then when you look at that interview that he gave, and Brian, this is to your point, it's as if you're saying sorry, not sorry. If you're saying no, I'd still do it, then are you really sorry?
Well, I'm playing devil's advocate for a second, because I think it's probably for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's past. It happened. You can't change it no matter how hard you try. But 2, I think it really kind of did serve as a real lesson for Scottie, and in terms of leadership and how to handle himself. And he was the first to say, in the documentary, after that, we put it behind us, we moved forward, and even the team acknowledged Scottie became a much better leader after that. He probably phrased it maybe differently, in the actual interview, and it was cut maybe a little little bit to play for the emotion at the time. But yeah, Scottie Pippen wasn't always given the best light. And I think this documentary kind of highlights on a lot of the questionable and controversial parts that he did in that tenure.
Yeah, and one more thing I want to compare to this is that the way Pippen apologized immediately after that game reminded me of later on in the series when Jordan, the night that he punched Steve Kerr, he literally got Steve Kerr's number from someone and apologized for punching him. And
he got it from Phil Jackson.
Got it from Phil Jackson. Sorry, I apologize. He got it from Phil Jackson, and Kerr and Jordan ended up having a great relationship after that. But that Pippen apology really stuck with me, it's probably gonna stick with me for a while. So just for those kids who watch this, if you say, no, I'm going to sit this play out if I'm not going to get the ball, that just shows you care more about yourself than you care about the team, even if your team wins the game. So don't do
unless you're hurt.
Just don't. Unless you're hurt. Unless you're hurt.
If I were Scottie Pippen, just to piggyback off on something we said earlier, if I were him, I'd be worshiping Larry Kukoc day after day. Because let's look at it this way. If he misses that shot, Tony Kukoc, my apologies. If Kukoc misses that shot and they don't get the basket and they lose the game, Scottie Pippen's going to be was probably remembered in infamy for the rest of his life in basketball, quite frankly.
Absolutely. So now with less than 10 minutes to go, let's go into the guy who Bryan has a lot of words to say about, and that is Jerry Krause, the well-known general manager who put that puzzle together, put that entire team together, a team that won 6 NBA titles in the 1990s. But of course, when we saw the beginning of the documentary, when he said that no matter what happens, this was going to be Phil Jackson's last year, that's stirred up some controversy. Now, obviously, Jerry Krause, may he rest in peace. We'll never know what he has to say based on what we all saw from this docuseries. But Bryan, you've got stuff to say, so the screen's yours. Go for it, my friend.
All right, let me preface this by what I'm about to say. Jerry Krause deserves a lot of respect for putting those Bulls team together. He traded for Scottie Pippen. He got Tony Kukoc. He got guys like Steve Kerr, and he helped bring in Phil Jackson as coach of the Bulls. But for me, with Jerry Krause, was that, like, I read a comment somewhere that I think summed it up perfectly. Jerry Krause deserved more respect than he actually was probably needed to get. But the problem is that he wanted more respect than he actually deserved. And for me, the absolute arrogance in those final years with the Bulls, like that team that they had together, just completely baffles me. Like saying stuff like, oh, it's the organizations that win these championships. Like, two problems with that. One, no, because there are no executives running on the court and they're not the ones making the plays on the sidelines.
I was thinking the same thing.
And two, you know what it said to me? It said that everyone on the court, everyone on the sidelines is replaceable. Everyone is replaceable. Phil Jackson is replaceable. Scottie Pippen is replaceable. And Michael Jordan is replaceable. The absolute arrogance with that logic is completely dumbfounded. And like the stuff that the part that really irritated me the most about Krause was when Michael Jordan said he wanted to play with Phil Jackson. Like, he didn't want to play for any other coach besides Phil Jackson. And Michael Jordan is the face of your franchise. People are coming from around the world to see this guy play. How do you respond to this? Oh, yeah, well, fine. Go do whatever you want then. Like, we'll just keep building the team. I'm sorry, and I'm trying not to speak ill of the dead, but how stupid can you get when you are selling out arenas? People are coming to your games. Business is booming. Everyone's happy. Why are you doing this? Is it because you weren't given enough credit? I mean, come on. Look, I understand relationships are not perfect, and sometimes you got to work with people that you don't like Phil Jackson. But the fact that you wanted to go as far as to tell Phil Jackson, a guy who won you 6 championships and could have led you into the new millennium, just to tell him, I don't care if you go 82-0, you're gone. Bye-bye. To tell Michael Jordan, the face of our franchise, whatever, you're replaceable. We can find someone else to come in and fill in your shoes. And treating Scottie Pippen like that and releasing Dennis Rodman, I mean, it made no sense. Personally, it made no sense business-wise, and it made no sense whatsoever. And to this day, and even in the documentary, there's no excuse for it. It's complete stupidity.
I agree with your point, Bryan, that there's a lot of stuff Jerry Krause did wrong. He probably could have kept the Bulls going for at least a few more years as competitors.
2 or 3, give or take. 2 or 3.
I think they could have gotten 2 more rings. I'm being serious. They probably could have gotten at least 2 more rings.
Point being, we'll never know. And I agree with the fact that he did sully a lot of things in the relationships between Phil Jackson and the players, and there's no real excuse for just saying at the beginning of a year that this is going to be your last run and doing the whole 82-0, that's inexcusable. But at the same time, I feel like his actions come from a pretty decent point that in a player-dominated NBA, general managers and front office members alike don't quite get as much credit as they deserve. Let me say this. The NBA is unlike a lot of other professional leagues that there are. In no league are players more able to carry a franchise than in the NBA. You can't really do that in the NFL. You certainly can't do it in Major League Baseball, and I'm sure you probably can't do it in the NHL, but you guys would know better than me. And its point is, a lot of times general managers and front office members get kind of looked over. Like, let me ask you guys, all right, Bryan, I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Name 5 general managers. Go.
And wait, in any sport or like in basketball?
In the NBA. Name me 5. I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Give me 5 general managers. Go.
You got me there. You got me there on that one. And let me be clear. Let me be clear with this one though. Like, I'm not saying Jerry Krause didn't do any good. Obviously, he did a lot of good to help those teams.
Sure.
My whole thing was just how he handled it. And just to go even, oh my God, I just lost my train of thought of what I was about to say. But again, like Jerry Krause, he did do a lot of good things, and I think they were well intentioned, like from a perspective. But the way he went about it was horrific. And actually, this was going to be my point. Because what separates the NBA from a lot of other leagues is that 2 or 3 guys can carry an entire team. And you had your core in place. You had Michael Jordan. Okay, you were probably going to lose Scottie Pippen at some point because that bridge was going to be burned. You still had Dennis Rodman. You still had Tony Kukoc. You still had Steve Kerr. You still had the main core intact. Just 3 of those, that combination of Jordan, Rodman, Kukoc, and Kerr, they probably could have carried you to at least one more title. And just the fact that you wanted to dismantle it when business was booming, and just how he went and just alienating players from the organization and just causing all this bad blood when it didn't need to exist. That's where I have an issue with. It's not that Krause wanted to make certain moves. If it was just the stuff with Scottie Pippen and Krause, okay, they got to settle out their business like professionals. That's fair. But the fact that you had to go as far as to put the coach on the spot and tell them that you're going to be fired after this season, which alienated the entire team and your star player, the best player in the world.
Even if they were going to win a championship, if they won a championship, that he was going to be fired. You're going to fire your coach after winning the NBA Finals for your second straight three-peat and for the 6th time in the decade? Are you serious?
And just one side note before we start getting into the final thoughts. I applaud Phil Jackson for not going back for the 98-99 season. I would have looked at that as a giant insult. Now that I won, now you want me to come back so I can do something good for you? Screw off. Just screw off. I wouldn't have done it any different. I applaud Phil Jackson for not going back to the Bulls.
Let me ask you this very quickly before we run out of time. If Jerry Krause did not go until 2003 to be the GM of the Bulls, okay, if his tenure ended 99 or 2000 and the Bulls were still in the running to possibly go on one more finals run, if Krause was gone, do you think Phil Jackson would be back?
I don't know, because at that point he was already killing it in LA. He was already with the Lakers, and he was already getting a good thing going with Shaq and Kobe. I don't see it happening. I think that bridge was burned.
James, final thoughts.
Well, again, as I'm sure the general manager thing might have showed, and by the way, there's still time, Brian. But anyway, it does prove a general point that while Jerry Krause's intentions were perfectly reasonable and still resonate in a league that continues to be extremely player-friendly to an extent where general managers and front office members get overshadowed, but the actions he took to get there were pretty were just not agreeable. I'm going to reference one quote real quick that I learned in one of my journalism classes, that actions have an elasticity that ethical judgments are unaware of. And I think you could really see that with the way Krause handled his business with trying to prove the point that he did. I mean, also, I'll say this. If I were a quote-unquote GOAT in basketball, I'd much rather have him than a guy like Dan Gilbert, who, when you ask for a playmaker to compete with the Warriors, gives you Kyle Korver.
All right, well, unfortunately, we'll never hear from Krause, but very controversial stuff that we saw out of that docuseries. All right, I want to thank James Murphy, Bryan Hultgren. Second straight week that we have a 3-person panel. Hopefully we'll have a bigger panel next week. For now, I'm Matt Price. We will see you next time.